Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ben Sobol, policy analyst at MCC Brussels. Thank you very much for being here with us, and we will start the panel discussion. Migration and why borders matter. And it is my honor and privilege to be the chair of tonight's forum.
No borders, I think, are one of the main reasons of our dislocated societies. Reinstating borders are the beginning of the answer to start rebuilding our nation states. A defined territory, a home country, defined by borders, the country where we belong, the country that will look after us, the safe haven from which we can start rebuilding the lives of our people and the future generations in Europe. I invite you all to rehabilitate borders and work together towards building the alliance of the sovereign nations.
If you look at the sort of more left-wing analysis of migration, their analysis tends to focus on economic factors, simply understanding migration quantitatively, making arguments which is backed up by the stats, that migrants tend to be younger and healthier, they tend to use the welfare state less, and indeed the health service less than the indigenous population if they come to, say, the UK, and that they often do jobs which are the 3Ds, dirty, demeaning, and dangerous, which local populations won't do. So there are a lot of these types of analysis that they have data to back it up, but what they fail to address is the cultural impact, the things that cannot be quantified, things that are more qualitative. We know that migration is changing culture. It's very hard to tell, to prove it in any data sort of sense, but we know it when we see it. But because you cannot quantify it, the more technocratic social sciences deny its existence. I suppose like how in the sciences, it's very material driven because you can't quantify consciousness, so it's excluded from the sciences by analogy.
Knowing where to draw a line is important. As a father, I learned that unless I learned where to draw a line, I would lose my son. It's a very simple, very basic thing that even children need boundaries, never mind a collection of millions of people. And from the earliest point onwards, the drawing of lines or boundaries, because we're talking about not national borders, but boundaries, is a civilizational accomplishment. In fact, you can see civilization, the emergence, particularly Western civilization, but it's very similar in the Asian context. The civilization of societies evolves through a continuous drawing of lines. Where you draw a line has got a significance that is profoundly organic to the cultural imagination of a particular community.
Human beings are social beings that need a sense of belonging and that are naturally attached to their family, their community, and their country. In addition, European civilization is rooted in Christian values. The EU empire has consciously dismantled these. Their efforts have gone into making families redundant, people interchangeable, communities outdated, and countries obsolete. And well, if we need to mention God, they consider it as a concept of previous centuries. Now, I think that if you deprive people of those things in their lives that are bigger than themselves, family, country, and God, you morally disarm them. If you are deprived of belonging, why accept any sacrifice? Why fight, risk pain or death? And if you have lost your faith, what does it do to your moral standards and your sense of continuity?
Of course, you cannot do without borders. In the real world, you cannot do without borders, and even the most hostile individual who hates national borders will find some borders that they will worship. In the context of the Anglo-American world, they all love what they call safe spaces. I don't know if you've heard that in your society. They draw safe spaces where people are protected from criticism or from the pressures of everyday life. And the people that kind of criticize Donald Trump for wanting to build a wall on the Mexican-American border are the same people that insist that they must have a safe space. They must have a safe space in order to protect themselves. So they're aware of the fact that these distinctions are really quite important.
We can see that even among nation states here in Europe, there are a lot of approaches to how we should handle migration. You can particularly see an East and West division, and you can obviously find historical reasons why some countries think about this issue differently, why other countries think about this differently. How can we create dialogue in this case? Because obviously the European Union is supposed to be this intermediary entity that can be the bridge in this dialogue, but we can clearly see that even on the EU level, we cannot properly find a common answer. So what is it that, for example, nation states should pay attention to when it comes to understanding this issue better and finding better solutions and better conclusions?
How can we create dialogue on immigration? Well, I think that is, we cannot create, it should not even be the objective to create dialogue. This is what the Immigration Pact attempts to do in saying to all the European nation states that we should have the same rules and the same objectives with regards to immigration. Now, of course, that is wrong. It depends on the country you have, and it depends on what you want for your country, how you deal with immigration. What Germany wants is totally different from what France wants with regards to immigration, or what Hungary wants with regards to immigration. So I think the first thing is that we need to accept that immigration policy is a national policy and cannot be one fits all for 27 member states. That is just outrageous.
I think we have a phobia of compromise now for some reason. But Europe was built on compromise, and we're losing that now because of this tyranny of generalization, of abstraction. And I think we need to get back to understanding the world in the particularity of its reality, because abstractions are ideals, they're not real.
In general, the problem that's facing European societies is precisely that countries like Germany and Britain and France are relying on cheap labor as a substitute for raising productivity. And the way you raise productivity, in other words, which is the main driver of economic growth, is by technological innovation and investing in industry. And if you look at the levels of industrial investment in European societies, especially since 2008, but even before that, it's been flat. So when you have a reluctance to innovate and invest in technology and to raise productivity through technological means, but rely on cheap labor as a way of sustaining your economy, you are going to have two big problems. One is that you're relying entirely on cheap labor, which will then lower the wages of other workers that are already there within that society. But secondly, it will mean that it leads to economic stagnation.
One of the things I've seen on the left in the UK is what I call ideological gentrification. So middle-class moral panics have taken over the left. It used to represent class interests. It absolutely does not now. It represents basically cosmopolitan Islington middle-class people. I grew up partly near Whitehaven in the north of England. And people in Whitehaven, the most impoverished, the people with the least opportunities and get no sympathy from anyone are young working-class lads from places like Whitehaven. No one cares about them. If you look at certainly the Anglosphere, and perhaps France is the same, is that we're seeing an erosion of communities. And I think largely because there's no logic that we care about outside the market. It's super neoliberal now. Things like community, you can't put a value on that. They're intangible values. So now local services, we used to know that after school clubs for kids was always going to be a cost. They're not profitable, but they play an intangible value in the community. But we've stripped them away because you can't justify it in a spreadsheet. No one cares. And so I think what's happened is we've lost a sense that not everything can be quantified, that real qualities are precisely that, they're qualitative. They play a social value that we perhaps cannot put in an Excel spreadsheet. And as long as we have this culture dominated by Excel and nothing, then we're not really going to, then we're going to continue to see the sort of erosion we've seen in sort of Western European countries.
Why are European countries not following the example? Is because we can't. We can no longer follow a national migration policy. You must understand that the way the EU is functioning at the moment, we are constrained totally by EU legislation when it comes to migration. So we have nothing to say. And this is only going to get worse with the new Pact for Asylum and Immigration.
You used the metaphor eye of the storm, and it puts all the responsibility on the nation taking in the immigrants. And I think an important thing to point out is you're talking about policies around them. I suppose you're referring to how we treat them in society. But the people, for example, that came to Europe and now are celebrating their terror attacks and Hamas, they have these views instilled by their own country, by their own beliefs, and we can't easily change that. So then maybe the problem are the immigrants coming with themselves with those views and not how we treat them when we take them in.
We must focus wholly on a principle, which is that a people, if they have a right over who they allow in and possibly over who they allow out of their community, and that may not even be necessarily ethno-linguistic or national, perhaps even religious groups, but a people have a right to say no to migration. Because I'll actually end on a little rhetorical question, which is, I would ask, let's say, hypothetically, Martians could come here as migrants. Would we or would we not have the right to say no to them, even if they objectively were going to improve the society in every metric and there was going to be no harm?
The very ideal of democracy, which came to the fore in the Athenian era, could not have come about if there were no borders, there were no walls. From the Greeks to the present day, borders do have a very important moral role to play, and I would argue that is not for economic reasons. It's not the economic drivers one way or the other. It's not the political reasons, but rather the fact that within the West, particularly in the Anglo-American world, but also in France, Holland, and elsewhere, we've lost the language of morality. We are no longer able to give meaning to moral norms. And as a result of that, we've fundamentally find it very difficult to know where to draw a line.